Good afternoon. I'm Marie Harf, Executive Director of Perry Worldhouse, and I'm excited to welcome all of you to our special event today, including some of my students I see in the audience, which makes me very happy. As many of you already know, Perry Worldhouse is the University of Pennsylvania's hub for global engagement, where we work to build bridges between academia and policy on the world's most pressing issues. Our work is structured around 4 thematic pillars: democracy, security, climate change, and human rights and global justice. I am thrilled to welcome you to this special keynote today, which is opening our annual Human Rights Conference, which will focus this year on migration and human rights. As the world is experiencing unprecedented levels of displacement driven by conflict, economic insecurity and instability, and the impacts of climate change, irregular and often dangerous migration is on the rise. This trend exacerbates an already divisive and often quite cruel political debate, not just here in the United States, but around the world, about migrants and migration, even though their role in economic growth, innovation, and cultural richness is well documented. We are so grateful that institutions like the International Organization for Migration remain committed to the principle that safe and orderly migration benefits migrants, governments, societies, and also fosters shared prosperity. We are honored to have with us today the Honorable Amy Pope, IOM's Director General, and this year's Takor Distinguished Visiting Fellow here at Perry Worldhouse. Pope became Director General of the International Organization for Migration in October 2023, bringing a wealth of experience in addressing complex migration issues and a passion for changing the global narrative about people on the move. She is also the first woman to hold that post in IOM's 73-year history. Before joining IOM, Ms. Pope served as the Senior Advisor on Migration to U.S. President Joe Biden and as the Deputy Homeland Security Advisor to President Barack Obama, where I had the pleasure of working with her. While at the White House, she developed and implemented comprehensive strategies to address migration in areas such as countering trafficking in persons, resettling refugees and vulnerable people, and preparing communities to respond and adapt to climate-related crises. Ms. Pope has also held positions at the U.S. Department of Justice, in the U.S. Senate, and was a partner in the London-based law firm Schillings. She graduated magna cum laude from the Duke University School of Law and has a BA in political science from Haverford College and is also a native of Pennsylvania, so we are happy to have her back here in the state. Our moderator today will be our very own Zaid Raad Al-Hussein. Zaid is currently the President and CEO of the International Peace Institute and the Perry Worldhouse Professor of the Practice of Law and Human Rights here at the University of Pennsylvania. He is a longtime distinguished diplomat and previously served as the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights from 2014 to 2018. We will begin with some remarks from Director General Pope, and then they will have a moderated conversation on stage to be followed by your questions, so start thinking about them. Finally, before I welcome Ms. Pope to the stage, I would like to take a moment to thank the Takor family for generously supporting our Global Justice and Human Rights program and for making today's event and the conference this week possible. Now, please help me welcome Amy Pope to the stage.
It's great to be working with you again, and it's great to be here back in Pennsylvania. I did go to that little college down the road and would often come into Philadelphia to play the oboe, of all things. So it's a lot of fun to be back. And I want to just congratulate the Perry Worldhouse for the conference that you all are holding. A conversation on global justice and human rights is more important than ever before, and it's a tremendous honor to be part of it, particularly when I'm talking about the issue of migration, and to be part of a broader conversation in terms of finding a way forward. So I start from the premise that migration is human. Right? We cannot talk about human civilization without talking about migration. And whether it's people who are fleeing conflicts, people who are looking for better opportunities, people who are fleeing persecution, this is the story of human civilization. And every single one of us in this room, every single one of us on this planet has the story somewhere in their background. For me, my family hails from Europe, from places in the UK and Germany and Sweden, fleeing poverty, frankly. They were farmers who couldn't make a living at home, and they came to the United States in search of something better. But I also have roots in West Africa and India, people who came as indentured servants into the Caribbean and into the Americas to help build this country. My story is not unique. Every single person across the Americas has some version of the story. Unfortunately, we often forget it when we're talking about politics. But it's fair to say that migration today is much more complex. It's much more multifaceted than it's ever been. And what we're seeing is that conflict and violence, which drives much of the world's displacement, it's longer and it's more intractable. We're also seeing the impact of climate driving migration. We're seeing farmers who can no longer farm their land. We're seeing instances of people who are losing their homes to storms or rising sea levels. We're seeing increasing stories of communities that are flooded and that are forced to move. So we have a combination of economic forces, we have political forces, we have the impacts of disaster on communities, and when you pull all of that together, we're seeing unprecedented movements of people all across the world. I want to start with the one that is really driving a political conversation that's happening here in this country and everywhere I visit, frankly. And that's the concept of irregular migration. People who are moving without visas, people who are moving, coming up to borders, who are crossing the Mediterranean or crossing deserts to end up in some other country. This is the conversation that you often see when you turn on the news or when you open the newspaper. Stories of people who are getting on boats, people who are paying smugglers and traffickers, or coming across a border wall. And I want to start by saying that that kind of migration is actually not good for anyone. And aside from where you are on the political spectrum, a situation where people are choosing to put their lives in the hands of a smuggler because they see that as their best option, that is not good for anyone. It doesn't mean that we walk away from our humanitarian obligations or the need for compassion or understanding, but it does mean coming to terms with the reality that people are making this choice because they have no alternative or they have a less desirable alternative is critical. And it's for that reason I've spent my entire career working on the issue of migration in some form or another. It's for that reason that I don't personally advocate for migration at any time, for any reason, under any circumstances. We know the public support is not there for that, but what we also know is that it's not good when we talk about human rights or the future or the well-being of the migrants themselves. I also want to acknowledge that governments are expected to manage their borders, and public demands that. And it's legitimate. It's a legitimate thing for the public to expect that border management be efficient and effective. Yes, it should also be humane. But when the public sees the opposite, when they see people coming across boats or when they see people coming to a border, when they see migration being instrumentalized, when they see chaos, what we see happening is that the public is turning against migration. And worse, the public is turning against migrants themselves. When I ran to become the Director General, one of my key goals was to change the conversation on migration, to change the narrative. But it's not going to happen unless the public perceives that migration can be managed effectively. But there's a much bigger reason why it's important to have a functioning, working, orderly migration system. And it starts with the people that we serve at IOM. It starts with the migrants themselves. Dangerous, irregular migration is bad for the migrants themselves. It's the people who are on the move who are hurt the most. Within IOM, we track missing migrants. And last year was our deadliest year on record. And the truth is, we don't even get close to what we think are the real numbers of people who are dying, who are exploited, who are kidnapped, who are raped, who are en route. So we know of thousands of people who perish along the way. What we don't know are the thousands more of the untold stories of people who are being harmed. Now, death is the most extreme danger that migrants face, but I speak to migrants all over the world, and I can tell you the horrific stories I hear about people who are being exploited, women who are being sexually abused, children who face uncertainty and terror as they move through these irregular routes. And kidnapping is basically just part of the deal. Last month I was in Guatemala, and I had the chance to go down to the border of Guatemala and Mexico with the president of Guatemala, and we spoke to a number of Guatemalans who were coming back home. And I spoke to one woman, she was in her 60s, and she had decided to leave because she lived in a community that had been plagued by ongoing violence, effectively gang violence. And they had started to extort her and her family's business, and she didn't feel like she could stay there safely anymore. So she decided that she was going to pay a smuggler to go to the US border. On her way, she was kidnapped by a Mexican cartel. They held her for 2 months, forcing her to cook and clean for them until she could find the money to pay the ransom. Now, this is not an atypical story. I hear this story all over the world, variations of this story. I've heard from Bangladeshi nationals in Libya. I've heard from anybody who's coming across Mexico into the United States. And if you are a defender of human rights, if you believe ultimately migration should be human-centric, and I think all of us in this room probably are, then you should be against a system that takes as a given that we will allow people to rely on this broken system as a way to finding safety or a better job opportunity or future for themselves. Because what I see are smugglers and traffickers who are taking advantage of some of the world's most vulnerable people, abusing them, treating them as a commodity. So keeping migrants out of these networks is a vital part of what it means to be about human rights. It's also why we at IOM work with people who don't have a legal right to stay, who don't have status in a country. We help them get home. We help them get home safely and voluntarily. What I'm seeing right now is that much of the migration discussion in recent years has been on people who are moving from south to north. But in recent months, we're seeing a switch. We're seeing people move south. I saw it when I was in Guatemala. I saw it a couple weeks ago when I was in Peru. And what I see throughout every story I hear are people being exploited, people who do not have safe ways to move. And unfortunately, we're not talking about that. Instead, we're talking about the politics, we're talking about border enforcement, we're talking about the instruments of the system. And what we're leaving out are the humans. And the fact that the humans are at the heart of what we're seeing politically, of why they move. So if we're going to take apart this system where people are suffering, where the politics are only becoming more polarized, where people are fighting each other about the way forward, we need to do more than just manage numbers. We need to focus more on what's happening, what's driving people to move, and engaging with the communities of origin, but more importantly, engaging with the communities of destination. We all know that right now, no country in the world is going to fully wall itself off from wars or disease or economic disparity. I was in Haiti earlier this week. I just got in last night. In Haiti, there have been 1 million people who've been displaced. In Port-au-Prince, 85% of the capital is controlled by gangs. There are people who have been displaced time and again because their neighborhood has been taken as gang territory, and the people living there are facing extortion, they're facing trafficking, they're facing sexual violence. It's not a surprise then that Haitians are moving. And they're not just moving to the United States, they're moving to neighboring Caribbean islands. And if we want to actually come up with a better system where Haitians are not leaving Haiti, we need to address the question of peace and stability as a starting point. So if we're going to take on the issue effectively, we need to look at why people are moving. We need to build development strategies that address why people are moving. We need to recognize the demand for labor that exists in many of the strong economies of the world. And frankly, we need to stop relying on a system that pays smugglers and traffickers to do what the world otherwise needs. So we just take a minute and we look at what's happening globally. 30 of the world's wealthiest economies last year had labor shortages. Those unfilled jobs cost about $1.3 trillion in lost GDP. And those labor shortages are in every sector. Yes, the world needs engineers. Yes, the world needs doctors, but the world also needs people to work as nurses in construction, in manufacturing, in the service sector, in agriculture. And that situation is getting worse as communities age. This is a particular problem in places across Europe, Spain, Portugal, Italy, and parts of Asia, Japan, and the Republic of Korea. But it's going to be increasingly a reality for more and more economies around the world. But unfortunately, the system that we've built to connect people to job opportunities was built mostly in the 1950s, in the wake of World War II. If you just think for a second about what's different today in 2025 from the 1950s, you think about whether a system built then could work now, it's quickly apparent that it's become outdated. So what we need are safer, fairer, more efficient systems that reward those who follow a legal pathway, but more importantly, that offer ways for people to move safely, to move legally with a visa, to get a job opportunity. Right now, we have the refugee resettlement system. The United States resettled the most refugees in recent past last year. Does anybody know the number? 100,000. There are millions of displaced people around the world. Millions. In Haiti, 1 million already. And the United States resettled 100,000. So it's no question that the system built for resettling refugees is nowhere close to what's needed to meet the need. Then you add in labor shortages, you add in opportunities for work, you add in opportunities for student visas, and you quickly see how the system that we've built is no longer servicing the economies and the communities who need migration. So if we want to rethink how migration works, and that's what I love doing, that's what I've spent my career doing, it's first explicitly recognizing the link between development and migration. We know that when there is poor development in a country, it often fuels irregular migration. But we also know that migration can catalyze development. In fact, migrants' remittances are already significantly boosting developing economies. There were over 600 million, where is my cocoa, in remittances last year, more than foreign development assistance, more than the United States is giving, billion is the answer. Right? So what if we leverage those remittances as a tool for development, as opposed to relying on development assistance alone? Second, migration policies have to be tied to growing labor demands. People who migrate irregularly right now are finding jobs. The fact is, we know there's an imbalance between migration paths and the needs of businesses who would hire them, particularly in places like construction, hospitality, or healthcare. In the United States, there's been a 0% unemployment rate in construction. And when we look at the construction sector alone, the number of irregular migrants filling jobs is quite high. So tie those policies together. Third, development funds should be directed towards skills training for would-be migrants. That would benefit everyone. For example, in Bangladesh, The technical schools offer would-be migrants trained in school skills such as car repair and childcare. Or in Germany, where an initiative to train and recruit nurses internationally has benefits locally as well for the recipient countries as well as for Germany. And then ensure that trained workers can get jobs through ethical, regular channels where they're paid a fair wage, where there's proper oversight, where they're able to get jobs that are competitive with nationals. So they're not undercutting the wages that are paid to nationals. There's one example I love. It's a tiny one. But there's a labor mobility agreement between Australia and the small nation of Tuvalu. Tuvalu is an island state that is likely to disappear over the next several decades because of rising sea levels. What Australia has done is to create a labor pathway for nationals of Tuvalu to go and work in Australia, to get the skills they need, to make money, to send money back, and to design a future for themselves. They're thinking about how can we use migration as a way to meet the labor market needs of Australia, but also address a development issue. And fourth, when regular and legal migration is allowed, we can't just stop at giving people permission to work. We need local officials, community leaders, the faith leaders, the private sector to be engaged, not just to help migrants integrate into their communities, but because we do know it has an impact on schools, it has an impact on hospitals and on infrastructure. So implementing these four pieces is not going to solve all of the world's problems, but what I think it could do is make sure we have greater public confidence, that where migration is well managed, and where it offers opportunity for migrants and stability for communities, that migration is a net benefit, not a net negative. I do this work because I grew up in a community in Pittsburgh where I lived next to a survivor of the Holocaust. And I remember as a 9-year-old seeing the tattoo on my neighbor's arm and saying to myself, not quite understanding why it was there, what would I do? What would I do if it were me who was living in that moment in time? And what can I do as an adult to make sure that we don't repeat those moments in time? And I went to law school and I became a prosecutor because I thought, well, the law is the way that we actually make change. I prosecuted human trafficking victims. I spoke to the survivors of trafficking and looked for ways to bring them into the work that we do. And a desire to protect the rights of those who are the most vulnerable is actually core to who I am as a person. But I also believe, and this is why I believe, having regular rules about migration is critical to protect those human rights. It's critical to protect those who are the most vulnerable. Relying on a system that profits traffickers and smugglers, that profits people who underpay migrants, that profits the exploitation of people is not in our national best interest, it's not in our global best interest, and it's not in the best interest of the human being. And I believe that if we can work together on this, if we can set aside the politics, and we can approach the problem, the challenge, from all sides, that we can actually turn this around from a challenge into an opportunity. And I believe ultimately, if we want real sustainable development, not just what we put on a pin, if we want really to create better outcomes for more people, it's critical that we start working on this system now. So I look forward to our conversation and to your questions, and I appreciate your engagement.
So, Amy, thank you for starting us off so eloquently. I don't think anyone here would dispute the point you're making about the suffering of people who are on the move, often in perilous conditions, being exploited by those who are profiting from their vulnerability. I think what's so sad from a human rights point of view is that governments are still resorting, when hardening their borders, to placing them in places of detention, to in effect criminalize the movement, to stigmatize them like that. And we saw only a few years ago women and children separated, families separated. So is there no alternative to those sorts of cruelties? We speak about control of borders, and so why not make judges more available, set up courts so that you individually assess each person's claim, as opposed to what we saw in Europe so often, which was sort of wholesale pushback over people without individual assessment. So how do we deal with that side, the other side, where you can control, if you're going from soft border to hard border, and IOM's mission, as you so correctly keep pointing out, is humane movement of peoples. So what are the alternatives to detention facilities, family separations, the sorts of measures we've been seeing as of late? And if migration is growing, so is xenophobia, so is the use by political actors of migrants as a sort of football to win votes and to win political approval.
So first of all, thank you for the question. But I'm going to challenge the question a little bit, because this actually is what happens every time we talk about migration, is that people focus right at the border. Yeah. What's happening at the border. And that actually is the first mistake that we make when we talk about the issue of migration. It's politically easy to create solutions that focus on the border, but I'll tell you what, it's expensive, it's not very effective, and it can only be one piece of a broader strategy. Unfortunately, what we see is huge amounts of money being put into border enforcement. In the United States, it was about $23 billion last year. The Europeans are about the same. You look at what's being spent on addressing the drivers of migration, creating better systems for people to move, or to help stabilize communities. It's a fraction of that, right? IOM, our total budget last year was about $3.5 billion, and that was with a range of different donors, compared to the nearly $50 billion that's spent by just these particular regions. So I'm actually going to say yes, it's about having alternatives to detention, but really it's about addressing the bigger picture. So take what we know from the migrants themselves, because a lot of our work, we speak to migrants, we have something called the displacement tracking matrix, which gives all sorts of information about why people move, what are the drivers, what are they searching for, what is the barriers that they're encountering. And what we know is that for many migrants, they actually would be very, very happy to come to have a job, to be able to go home at the end of their visa, if it meant that they could have an opportunity to come back the next time. So that is actually a much more powerful incentive, the possibility of a future job, the possibility of coming back, than using detention, for example. Detention is something that you want to reserve for those who are posing a safety concern, a security concern, those who are criminals, right? But for the vast number of people on the move, there are actually much more effective ways to ensure compliance with law.
You mentioned you've just returned from Haiti. You were recently in Gaza, and you were recently in Guatemala, and you said you went. Can you share with us some of your impressions being in those conditions? Each one is rather different. Not easy, I would imagine, for anyone to be witness to all of that and sort of satisfy a sort of public appetite worldwide for answers when answers are not that obvious, perhaps. Yeah.
So for me, IOM operates in over 170 countries around the world, and we do humanitarian assistance. We work with communities, to drive solutions to displacement, and we ultimately look to facilitate regular migration, right, countering irregular migration. But what you see is if you take those three objectives and you go to a place like Haiti and you think about, okay, what are our available solutions here? How do we respond? It becomes it becomes pretty quickly clear that unless there is some level of peace and stability within Haiti, we're not actually going to end irregular migration out of Haiti. So I was in Port-au-Prince, where 85% of the city is controlled by the gangs, where communities are now displaced multiple times, where children have no hope of schooling, where women have no hope of protection, where the latrines are basically not functioning, there's no hygiene, and food is very scarce. It doesn't take the most brilliant minds to recognize that people living in those conditions year on year on year are going to look for alternatives. That's just human nature. And when the alternative is presented of putting your money in the hands of a smuggler so you can get out and so you maybe have a future for your child, a rational person will often take that decision. I was visiting last year. I was in Bangladesh and I went to Cox's Bazar, where, as you may know, there are about 1 million Rohingya who are living in Bangladesh who have fled Myanmar because of persecution. And those communities are not allowed to integrate into Bangladesh. The people are not allowed to get jobs for the most part. They're completely dependent on humanitarian aid. And you're, I'm sure, seeing what's happening with humanitarian aid. It's shrunk, it's unpredictable, and people are often facing starvation. And I spoke to a group of women. One of the things that is really important to me is to sit down with the women and understand how they are seeing the situation. Partly because, by the way, when you speak with a mixed group, the women won't often speak up. I saw that in Gaza too, by the way. So I'm meeting with them separately. And what they said was they were terrified at night because at night there was no security at all. They had no locks on their doors, and they were completely vulnerable to sexual violence. And when I asked them, well, do you know anybody who's left the camps in Cox's Bazar to go look for some other alternative, every single one of them raised their hand. Their family members, their brothers, their children had left in search of something else. And we just have to put ourselves, I mean, this is why part of my talking to people is because I want to understand what motivates people. And every single time I walk away thinking about, well, what would I do if I were sitting in that situation? If I thought, I have a 17-year-old daughter, if I thought that she was going to be raped at night, I would look for an alternative. I would get out. I would look for another option. And I think every parent faces that dilemma in the places we work. And so it's frankly part of why I've arrived at this conclusion that unless we address the drivers of migration, we are never going to get away from it. In Gaza, it's a different story, of course, because people can't leave. But what I see all over the world is that people make rational decisions. They're just like you and me. They're evaluating what options they have. And whole communities will collect money in order to send a young man across the Mediterranean because the option that he could end up and getting a job in Europe and sending that money back actually is better than the opportunities for that young person often where he's living.
When thinking of Gaza, it brings to mind, although there is a difference, but it brings to mind the siege of Sarajevo in the early 1990s, where people couldn't escape, and they were being bombed. We had opened up as the UN all these sort of channels to get humanitarian support in, and there's a continuous sort of request for financing, for funding to get the materials in to save lives. And there was a headline in the New York Times that essentially said that we fed the dead. We would keep them alive for a little bit longer so that they could be shelled or shot at. And it's a very cynical sort of way of looking at this. You correctly point your finger on the need for, deeper solutions or peacemaking at a level which needs to be intense. So would you not agree that there is a structural problem here, that if the humanitarian agencies keep demanding for more funding, more support, but there isn't a commensurate sort of level of attention on the political track, then you run the risk of the cynical approach of, having fed the dead, so to speak.
Look, I actually agree 100%. And you look at a situation like the refugee camps in Kenya. You now have an entire generation of people who were born in those camps who are now adults and are having children. And you speak to them about their future, and they don't see much of one, and they've become entirely dependent on humanitarian aid. Now, the good news is that in Kenya, we now have seen some movements from the government to think about how to integrate and enable people to get jobs. But until that point, if people did not have the opportunity to learn skills, to get jobs, to become part of their community, they really have nothing but to rely on humanitarian aid. And I think there's a real danger, one, that governments use that as their least difficult option. Let's just pay for people to be fed, and we don't have to deal with the hard problems. There's a second danger that we're actually leading people to depend entirely on humanitarian aid, so that when we see these sharp funding cuts that we're now seeing, we're actually leaving people starving with nothing left. There is the real loss of human dignity and human agency that results when people have been left with no other option. And more importantly, frankly, when the world needs new thinkers, new solutions, new options, when you look at the shortages that exist around the world, we actually need people to be part of that solution. So why we would think it was acceptable to basically warehouse millions of people in camps is really, it's a failure. It's a failure of our system to work properly. So I think, it is critical that we who work in this space take a hard look at what factors have enabled it. And it's, for me, why I'm pushing so hard on this concept of migration as a catalyst for development. And I want to just clarify, I'm not talking about everybody coming to the US or everybody coming into Europe. You look at the economies of West Africa or East Africa, for example, some of them are actually booming and quite successful, and there's real innovation and technology and, real energy happening. But it's not that easy for people to move from community to community and have their skills recognized, to have their education recognized, to get the kinds of jobs that would enable them to stay and be part of the economy. So let's think about how we can contribute to ensuring that the regional economies are better functioning. I think that's as important as talking about migration from south to north, or perhaps even more important.
If I wanted to depress myself, and granted, we live at a time when it's easy to depress oneself. It's a target-rich environment. You just have to look out. But I look at the intergovernmental record of the Evian Conference in July 1938, and I look at what European governments, because you mentioned them, and yes, it's important to look at South-South, and it's important to draw lessons, and important to understand the compassion with which many countries without resources will welcome others. But you look at the intergovernmental record of that conference, infamous conference, and the language is so reminiscent of what you hear today. Heavily industrialized, weak economies, no room, no housing. We don't want to import other people's problems. The same language. And Europe did have room, as it was abundantly obvious after the war, but they chose to say that they didn't. And what's sad is that language hasn't really changed very much in 80 years, practically. It's the same sort of language, the same constructs, the same, And so tell us about, from an IOM perspective, how do we deal with what is a fundamentally xenophobic issue? If we are a population of almost 8 billion, even if we have 100 million on the move, it's a fraction of the global population that's on the move. The majority of people are not moving anywhere, right? But we've built in our minds this impression that so many more people than actually is the case are moving. and we spook ourselves. And there are various leaders who say, tomorrow we'll be overwhelmed by, people coming from Africa. It's a youth bulge there and so forth. Well, who knows? Who knows? So how do we deal with xenophobia?
So I'm not an anthropologist, but I've been to enough places in the world and see this play out enough in my career to know that humans are tribal, right? This is a human phenomenon, and this is not limited to Europe or to the United States or the Americas, right? There's always an initial rejection of newcomers and new ways of thinking and being and doing and cooking and, styling your hair, you name it. But for me, one of the key strategies here is actually to appeal to the economic self-interest of governments, because frankly, the evidence is overwhelming that migration actually leads to better development outcomes for economies all over the world, even here in the United States. You look at what the United States, how quickly the United States has recovered post-COVID. And the economic analysis will always include migration as one of the reasons why the U.S. was able to move so quickly past the impacts of what had otherwise devastated economies globally. So my view is, one, let's engage at the community level, right? Let's engage with private sector actors, the small business owner. Let's bring them into that conversation. Let's avoid a situation where we're saying, you don't share my politics, so I'm not going to share a solution with you. We have to get past that, right? This is actually not about where you sit on the political spectrum, because I see communities on all sides of the political spectrum want to find better ways to deal with the issue of migration. So let's bring those various actors to the table. Everybody is welcome. Let's also think about how we engage with the private sector, because frankly, if anybody is benefiting from better migration policies, it's the private sector. They're the ones who need sustainable workforce. They're the ones who will create the jobs. And by the way, they're the ones who do have an opportunity to be part of helping migrants better integrate, be paid fairly, ensure that they're not taking jobs away from the national community, right? So bring them in as a real player in this conversation. And then bring in the mayors, bring in the small town community council, and deal with the various issues that people face. So if it's about enough places in the school system, okay, let's deal with that issue. But we tend not to. We tend to deal with migration in very one-dimensional ways, and then we wonder why it's not working very well.
Last question from me, Amy, and then we'll open up to questions from the audience. Are you enjoying your job?
I love it. I have the best job in the world.
I didn't. I found it intriguing. I found it like a massive puzzle that one had to try and solve. But I found the contact with the worst sort of sides of humanity also tough to deal with. And so you're much more resilient than I am, I have to say. So let's open it up to questions. Please, if you could limit yourself to a question as opposed to a long speech, we would, please, sir, we would very much appreciate it. You have a microphone right now.
Hi. Thank you. I liked the idea that you mentioned earlier on about the remittances. And is anybody actually managing remittances? I mean, I can think of that as money that might have been spent here if this migrant group had spent it all here. But that seems to be a really valuable concept, that it could be managed. And I'm someone whose grandfather had brothers who went back and forth to Italy. They came over here, they worked for a little while. And so part of the confusion is between migration and immigration. Yes. The idea that if we assume that every migrant is really scheming to be an immigrant.
Yeah, that's True. So there is some promising work happening around remittances, but it just hasn't been tapped to the level that it needs to. So we have at IOM some really good examples of where, for example, a Somali community, we partnered with them to have the community itself identify what were their number one objectives in terms of their own development outcomes. We asked them to prepare the project documents, and then we basically said, look, we will provide matching funds if you can get funds from your diaspora. So they actually put together this proposal for engaging. If you know the Somali diaspora, you have Somali diaspora here in the United States, in Canada, in Europe, and they were able to effectively then channel those resources into a project that the community had developed. And so that was one tiny example, which we're now replicating in other parts of the world. But that, to me, underscores the importance of tapping into diaspora communities. Diaspora are giving back all the time. I mean, you have these great examples in India and Kerala where you see a ton of migration out from the 70s, and those same communities are now some of the most well-developed in India. It's the remittances that were coming back. And so we're really working with partners like at the World Bank, figuring out how we unlock this. I really believe this is a place where we can drive more change.
Thank you. Yes, please. And Ewell, I'm coming to you. He's my student, so I'm already nominating him to speak.
I'm a Mainer, so Lewiston Auburn has a huge Somali population, and I imagine it was part of those efforts, and it's been integrated very well. I know in the beginning, when that community first came, there was some nervousness, but it's been a wonderful addition to Lewiston. I worked in Boston for a while, and that's been a great integration. I'm kind of wondering, how do we overcome this pessimism that, I see all the time, both on the political left and the political right, for different reasons, that everything is awful when there is seemingly very great work being done?
I mean, I think, look, we need to acknowledge what's not working well. And I think that has been one of the failures in the political dialogue of the last however many years, is that there are those who are afraid to say that maybe things aren't working well because they don't want to cede any ground to those who are against migration. But unless we recognize that, I don't think we're going to get into something better. The second is what I was saying at the beginning, is that irregular migration is undermining support for regular migration because it suggests that governments are not able to manage what is perceived as a basic responsibility of governments. And so finding ways to manage that and not necessarily conflating the two concepts is also key. And then I think it's, getting private sector to be a bit louder, really welcoming the faith community into the conversation, really welcoming, the folks of places like Lewiston who have real life experiences to talk about it. That's part of it. I mean, I tell this to people, I'm not disclosing anything I'm not supposed to, but my dad is a Trump voter, very conservative, evangelical Christian. I invited a Kurdish refugee over to my house for dinner one night, and by the end of dinner, my dad was like, Amy, we need to allow a lot more Kurdish refugees into our country. There's something really powerful about having that direct experience and then bringing people into the conversation to be part of the solution.
Okay. Michael? Yes, I nominated you, so you might as well speak.
I got it. Oh, you, sorry. Thanks so much, firstly. I'm interested, and I know I hate to sort of not divert, but I know the focus often is on borders, but I do want to come back to borders. I think the way that borders are viewed often are as sort of points of delimitation, lines on a map that are sort of represent one's inness or otherness. And I wonder to what extent, because there is a line of sort of understanding borders, a new line of thinking that sees borders as institutions of cooperation and engagement, and between sort of states that have them. And I wonder in what ways the IOM and your work has sort of involved expanding these definitions about what borders are, what purposes borders serve, and somewhat, I hope it's not too basic of a question, but I'd also love to know what your engagement with policy practitioners and diplomats are. I believe you are based in Geneva, and so I'd love to hear anything from this.
Eagle's father is the Ethiopian ambassador in Geneva. So
So we could talk for hours about borders. Let's start there. But let's accept that the borders that exist are the borders that we're now dealing with, right? And even if you have connections to the Horn of Africa, you will know that a lot of the borders there are a bit arbitrary, and they're communities who live back and forth. And my chief of staff, for example, is Somali Kenyan, who identifies as much with Somalia as he does with Kenya, right? So we recognize that. But at this moment in time, and I should also caveat it by saying there's lots of informal crossings all over the world, right? I went to one border crossing point between Guatemala and Mexico where there was an official border point, but everybody else was going across the river through unofficial port. Partly because they didn't want to pay taxes, or they did, a whole bunch of reasons, right? And I've been to many borders, and one of the key pieces of work we do with countries is to help them manage their borders better, because you'll know if you know the Horn of Africa, there are lots of concerns about the security of those borders, and frankly, those borders become breaking points for relationships between nations. And so, again, it goes back to having some level of confidence about who's crossing them and what does it mean for our security, what does it mean for our border communities is a key conversation that's being had all over the world. So we work with governments all over the world to help them figure out how they want to manage their borders. And one of the things that they're most interested in Asia and across Africa is actually some work we've been doing with Microsoft, which enables governments that don't necessarily already have the capacity to better understand who's crossing and why they're crossing, because that's critical to them as they're thinking about their futures, economies, their own nationals, their own security interests, their own economic interests. So accepting that we have borders and figuring out how to leverage them in ways that contribute to economic gains is one of the key pieces of work that we do with governments.
Yeah. Thank you. So can we go back and then we'll come this way? And sorry, Michael, you also wanted to speak. Yeah.
Go on this side.
Okay. Hi, thank you so much. So I have two questions. A lot of what you said I resonated with a lot. So I'm Sudanese, and I have family right now in Sudan who, I'm sorry. Yesterday was our 2-year war. But how do you deal with migrants who are moving to other countries and making sure that they are treated well? And how do you give capacity to those neighboring countries who are dealing with such a large influx of migrants like Egypt or Uganda or even Libya? So those are just my two questions. Thank you.
So I just want to take a minute to acknowledge what's happening in Sudan. I don't know if everybody here knows. It is the world's largest displacement crisis. There are 11 million people who have been displaced from their homes in Sudan, another 3.5 million who've been displaced across the borders. I had a chance to go there late this last fall, and you see communities that are dealing with the impacts of the conflict. Communities have been displaced time and time again. They get to one city, then the fighting moves to that city, they have to move again. Now, people are trying to go home to Khartoum. You probably know that there's Khartoum had been occupied, and now there's a chance for some communities to go back, but they're finding that their houses are gone in many cases, are totally looted, and people are starting from scratch. And Sudan is a country that actually, where many, many other migrants went, because there were good educational opportunities, there were good business opportunities. It was a place that attracted people from around the region. So the conflict in Sudan has had a much bigger impact than even just on the Sudanese. And it's a place where, when we talk about what's the answer to the migration of the Sudanese, it's peace, right? Unless we have serious commitment to finding a peaceful resolution of the conflict, we're going to have the continued movement of people. But it also raises an issue, which is, yes, I know the conversations we have about migration in places like the United States or in Europe, but the real conversations about migration should be happening in countries like Jordan, countries like Egypt, countries like Chad, where people move in the first instance. So what we see when we look at movements of people, whether it's because of a flood or an earthquake or a war, first people will move internally, right? And they will look for safety at home. If they can't find it, or if they have no opportunity, then they move to the neighboring country. So the population in Chad of Sudanese is in the millions, but Chad already is a country that does not have the capacity to even support many of its own nationals. So if we want to come up with a better migration policy, it's looking at how do we enable Chad to provide safety for Sudanese, provide some opportunities for Sudanese. And how do we support a country like Egypt, which has a large number of Syrians, of Sudanese, people from around the world. And they too are experiencing a lack of capacity and support. And far too often, and I think what we're most worried about now at this particular moment in time is that unless our major donors see a direct impact to their particular political or strategic interests, that they will stop supporting the people who are moving to these neighboring countries. And that, frankly, would lead to much more instability and far higher movements of people. So we can be, again, when you look at cost savings, when you look at human savings and support, number one, it's what support can we provide people in the country where they come from when they're displaced. Number two is how do we support people in the first country they move to. We saw, for example, when Lebanon started putting pressure on the Syrian communities that were in Lebanon, Syrians started to move. They started to move toward Europe. They started to move to other places. When we saw some of the movements within the Americas of Haitians, for example, there were Haitians who had been living in countries of the Americas for many years, but with inflationary pressures, with rising xenophobia, those Haitians started to move up toward the United States. So thinking about how we can develop strategies in partnership with the countries that are actually hosting large numbers of migrants and refugees is key to coming up with a better migration policy. And by the way, it wouldn't cost you $23 billion.
Lema, and then we'll come back to Michael.
Thank you so much. I just had a question around this sort of linkage between local communities and sort of political rhetoric at the top, because I think there's, this assumption, and I think a lot of us share it, that sort of solutions often come from local communities, that it's the, private sector. And while I kind of wholly believe that, and I work on, mayors and municipalities myself, we also see that, political rhetoric at the top matters a lot to moving those, so Canada, I'm a Canadian, has a private sponsorship model, heralded globally. It was there were basically no refugees coming in through the private sponsorship model under the Conservative government until, a Trudeau-led, now no longer in favor, but at the time very much in favor government came in on, really activating the private sponsorship model for Syrians in 2015. That made a huge change, and that activated sort of that local mobilization. So, how do you think about that relationship between political rhetoric at the top, national leadership on these issues, and some of that community level resistance that you talk about?
So first, it's again to go back to the where's migration happening, and are there solutions that we can be supporting that are closer to where migrants are coming from? So I was in Peru recently. Peru has, I think, the second largest population of Venezuelans. Regularizing those Venezuelans, even if it's a temporary status, so that they can get access to schooling and healthcare and the job market, is actually part of a broader migration strategy. If there's a perception that everybody is heading up to one country or going, right, you kind of lose the conversation. You get stuck in a very, I would say, one-dimensional solution that is actually not the right answer. So when we were looking, for example, at what are regular pathways, what does it mean to have legal pathways within the Americas, we actually weren't looking at the United States, because the United States is very, very complicated in terms of its existing immigration law, in terms of its Congress. You have to have Congress pass a bill, there's a whole bunch of barriers. We're actually looking in places like Barbados, where the Prime Minister said, well, one of the reasons we've become a member of IOM is because we know we need migrants, so we need to figure out a way to manage this effectively. We look at places like Mexico, where they had over 1 million jobs that they couldn't fill last year. We're looking at places like Brazil, which has a very active private sector, and trying to figure out how to break down options for people to get jobs there. So again, it's not thinking just about what's available in Canada or the United States or Europe. It's really thinking globally about where the opportunities exist and how we grow them. Because I don't think it works if you just look at Canada alone or the United States alone. Also, by the way, I don't think that's good for the countries of origin or the countries of the region, because what I also hear from these sort of more middle-income countries is that they're losing their talent. Yeah. They've educated the nurses, the doctors, the engineers, and then they leave for jobs that pay them better.
Yeah. Thank you. Michael, and then the gentleman behind you, and then we'll come to Marie.
So this is, you started to answer this with Lama's question. It's a sort of utopian question, I guess. If you sort of took away the bad global politics around migration and conflict, and you were really just thinking of, and maybe even borders if you want, just displacement that's happening because of, there are earthquakes and there's climate change and everything else. I'm just like, what do you think would be the kind of some of the necessary ingredients to really have that? I can't remember exactly how you put it, but it was like orderly, humane migration. Obviously, we don't have it now in general, but what would that system look like?
So I have a dream. All right, so take the Horn of Africa. We, at this point, we have seen drought after drought after drought in the Horn of Africa. In Somalia, we saw something like 6 seasons of drought, and it wasn't really until about the 5th season of drought that the international community started to mobilize and raise funds. But what they were trying to do at that point was just get the funds to help people eat or to support them as they move to a displaced persons camp, right? What if we use the kind of data foresight that you all are working on and that we're trying to leverage to identify in advance the communities that are at high risk of drought and who are highly dependent on livelihoods that would be impacted by drought? So if you're a farmer, if you herd livestock, if you can name it, right? And the communities that they support. And rather than wait for the 6th season of drought, we actually build interventions that look to the future. If that opportunity to farm your land the way you've done so forever is not going to exist anymore, why are we going to wait until you're displaced and you're desperate and you're looking for food, right? Why not start to engage and figure out, okay, maybe there are better ways of farming if you're going to farm. Maybe there are better ways of managing water. Actually, maybe there are better or different skills that your children will need. And then think about, well, can we develop those job opportunities in the country or in the region? Or is it more globally? So the whole idea is let's move away from what has been a reactive system that really turns on only once the emergency starts. And can we move toward a system where we are using information that is now available and becoming more and more sophisticated, that anticipates when communities are going to be pressed to leave. It won't take away from people who are being pushed out by war necessarily, but then you won't have this system clogged by so many people who are fleeing or leaving because of issues that could have been prevented.
Yeah. We've reached the end of our time, but I'd like to go to the gentleman just behind it, because you've been asking for the floor as a last question, and then we'll go back to Miri.
I wanted to know whether the problem is just the way that irregular migration is happening. You know, we don't like that there are smugglers that take advantage of people. Or is the problem also that we want to keep the level of migration lower? That we think migration is not always a good solution? I mean, you mentioned in Haiti the 1 million people that are displaced. I can only imagine that long term, if all those people were allowed to leave, well, that would be a solution in the short term. And, you know, that in the long term, that would be very bad for Haiti. So the problem is just that we don't want people, you know, taking unsafe measures to get out of Haiti? Or is it that we want people to stay and that migration is not actually a solution?
I think it's a little bit of both. The first best option that we hear from most people is that they want to be able to stay. That's the first option when we speak to people who are on the move. But it's not safe to stay, or they can't find a job, or the government is so corrupt that there's no chance of getting ahead, or, you know, you name it, right? So our first best option actually is to address those drivers that are causing people to leave in the first instance. And there's some really good examples of when we get down to the micro level, and I'm not talking about, okay, Guatemala needs development. I mean, what is happening right at the community where we're seeing the out-migration, and what is pushing those people to move, right? So developing solutions that allow people to stay. But then I do think there is a secondary piece of this, which is very much driven by the economies that are facing labor shortages, that are offering job opportunities, whether they're regular or irregular. And we need to recognize that until we fix that piece of it as well, we're not going to solve the problem. So even while we're working on peace and development in places like Haiti, if you can get a better job coming in as an irregular farm worker in, you name whatever country, right? There are going to be people who take that. So recognizing that the call of work is powerful, especially when you have nothing at home. Let's figure out a way to make it legal. Let's figure out a way to make it subject to oversight. Let's figure out a way to make sure that we know who's coming in and what their history is, et cetera. So that's really, it needs to be part of a common approach. And right now, it's not. I mean, right now, we tend to think about development and peace in one silo over here. We think of humanitarian work in one silo over here, and migration is somewhere in the middle, right?
Thank you. Miri.
Yes, well, first, everyone, please join me in thanking our wonderful speakers. We are so lucky to have you, Amy, and Zaid working on these issues. Thank you all for coming. I also want to acknowledge Colleen Connolly, who runs our human rights and global justice work here at Perry World House, and is putting this conference on in the busiest time of the year for our students. I know that. We do have one more public event of the semester next Tuesday, so go online, check out our website. If you would like to join, we would love to have you. And thank you for coming tonight. I know it's a really busy time of year, and we appreciate you being here. Thanks, guys.